Hi, this is Adam Wolf, physical therapist. Today we're going to be talking about real and relative motion in the blog. And so real and relative motion is something that it was really hammered home for me by Dr. Gary Gray, physical therapist, and the Gray Institute. I think it can best be summed up by the concept of bones moving, joints feeling or perceiving that movement, and muscles reacting to that movement. That's the paradigm that I think really represents pretty well. And so what we need to understand is that first, joints are spaces between bones. And if two bones move in the same direction at the same speed, then the joint doesn't necessarily feel anything. And so if we're talking about the hip bone, we would say it's the space between the pelvis and the femur. It's the knee, it's the space between the tibia and the femur, I'd say. And Gary Gray, Dr. David Tiberio would say that the patella is just along for the ride. 22 muscles attached to the femur and one attaches to the patella. And so most times it's not the patella's fault. Say it's the lack of timing or tracking in the way that the other bones are moving, and the patella becomes the part that hurts and it gets blamed, as does the VMO. And so we need to understand that a joint is space between bones, that if two bones move in the same direction at the same speed, the joint doesn't feel anything. And so if we're talking about the pelvis, we'll say my top hand is the pelvis and my bottom hand is the femur. The real bone motions of the pelvis and the femur, when I reach back like this, the bone motion is right rotation. You can see my pelvis rotates to the right. My left femur and right femur, both when I take my right hand and drive it in space behind me, is right rotation. So if we're looking at my left femur right here, the bone motions of my left femur when I reach like this is internal rotation. The pelvis is rotating inwards relative to the left femur, so that's also internal rotation. If we look at the right femur and pelvis, or the right hip at the same time, the pelvis is externally rotating relative to the right hip, and the right femur is also externally rotating the bones when I do that. So the bones are moving, but the joints don't necessarily feel what the bones are doing. And what I mean by that is my left hip, when I reach like this, the relative joint motion is that the left hip feels external rotation, even though both the left hip and the left femur and left pelvis are rotating inwards to the left when my right hand reaches. Because the top does it faster than the bottom when I reach, because I reach with my hand, both bones are moving internally, but the top does it faster. How we name motion in the extremities is by what the distal bone does on a fixed proximal bone. So both bones in this case are internally rotating, but the top does it faster. And how we name motion in the extremities, we fix the top and move the bottom, and so the joint in this hip, my left hip, feels external rotation. That's the relative joint motion. At the same time, in my right hip, when I take my right hand and reach back like this, my right femur rotates to the right. My pelvis rotates to the right. So at my right hip, both the bones that make up my right hip are externally rotating. But because my right hand does it faster than so my right hand reaches to the right, my top does it faster than the bottom, considered a top-down driver. And what that means is that both bones, while they're externally rotating, the top bone does it faster than the bottom because it's driven from above. And so both bones are externally rotating. The top does it faster than the bottom. If we fix the top and move the bottom, you see that the joint feels internal rotation here. And so real and relative motion, that's a quick example. What I talk about in my book, Real Movement, Perspective on Integrated Motion and Motor Control, is illustrated out as the concept of this. And so talking about real and relative motions, the same joint can feel the same motion in 5 different ways per plane of motion. And so the example that I'm going to use is this water bottle. We're going to say that the bottle is one bone that makes up the joint, and the bottle cap is the other bone that makes up the joint. So when it's on there are 5 ways that I can get the top to come off of this, or on for that matter. Okay, so one, I can fix the bottom and I can move the top. Number one. So the distal, proximal moving on a fixed distal. The second is I can fix the top and move the bottom. Distal moving on a fixed proximal, number 2. The third is they can both go to the left, but the top can go to the left farther or faster than the bottom, and so the top comes off. So both bones moving in the same direction, top moving faster than the bottom. They can both move to the right, the cap and the bottle, but the bottom goes faster and the top comes off. So that's 4. The both in the same direction, bottom faster than the top. And then the fifth way the same joint can feel the same motion in each plane of motion is they can go in opposite directions. So 1 is distal on fixed proximal, 2 is proximal on fixed distal, 3 is both in the same direction with the top faster than the bottom, 4 is both in the same direction, bottom faster than the top, 5 is opposite directions. And so that's what we're talking about with real versus relative motions, and why simply looking at the bone moving in space doesn't mean that's what the joint is feeling. And for me, it's really about getting the joints to feel what they need to for proprioceptors to lengthen. Because from a motor control perspective, thinking about the fact that the nervous system really governs all, bad input up into the brain and abnormal, the way we move, if we can't move around through a joint, we move around it, the way that the nervous system controls things is also going to be less than optimal. And so from a motor control theory, that lack of symmetry, that lack of the joint feeling what it should feel results in maybe the joint feeling the opposite motion of what we might want it to, even though it looks like one thing's happening, the joint could be feeling exactly the opposite. And tying this into the Goldilocks principle, as Dr. David Tiberios says in one of my favorites, is that injury typically occurs, or pain occurs, when there's typically injury, less more so than pain, because pain's an output, but too much motion at a joint, not enough motion at a joint, or motion at the wrong time. Too much, not enough, wrong time, lack of sequencing. As we know, motion is a synchronous dissociation. So that's this week's podcast or episode, what's this called, I guess, webcast, blog on real and relative motion. We're going to carry this forward next week into why it's important. If you know what should happen for an intended task when I reach and drive you in space, well, then I can see if it happens or not. And if it doesn't, of course, the question becomes, why doesn't it happen? And so then we have to have strategies to be able to analyze three-dimensional movement, what's happening in each plane of movement, in all three, at every joint in all three planes, for any intended task, and we can have strategies to do that. Talk about that next week. Thanks.